In the abstract of proximal origins, Dr. Gary and his fellow authors state categorically that the virus is not a laboratory construct. That doesn't sound to me like open-mindedness, and I wonder what you would tell a younger researcher or someone you were instructing in the scientific method about putting categorical statements into a scientific paper.
Well, it's important to emphasize that the paper in question, Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, published in March 2020, was not a research article. It was an opinion piece. It was published as a commentary, which is the section in the journal that holds opinion pieces.
Rand Paul RIPS, the anti-lab leak conspiracy theorists, the people who told all of us that we were the conspiracy theorists for asking where the pandemic originated. Well, now the Senate is digging into it. Rand Paul has never let up on this. And there was a panel taking place on Capitol Hill. Rand Paul and Senator Roger Marshall from Kansas were both asking the panel a series of questions. We'll go through this and see what happened in the Senate.
Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit statements for the record from U.S. Right to Know, Open the Books, America First Legal, Frontiers of Freedom, and Dr. Alina Chan.
Without objection.
So just in the last few minutes, Dr. Gary has told us that this couldn't have come from bats. It had to go through an intermediate host. That may well be true, but arguing against that is they tested 90,000 some odd animals, and there is no animal host that's been found. But what he also doesn't tell you is the animal host could be a laboratory animal. It could be passed serially through that, and that's one way of quickly adapting and pushing natural selection to adapt a virus towards humans. Dr. Alina Chan has written extensively about this, how this virus didn't show up clunky and poorly transmissible. This virus showed up immediately very transmissible in humans, as if it had been pre-adapted in a lab.
Or engineered, yeah.
Dr.
With the fur and
Ebright,
cleavage site.
Dr. Gary tells us that he's wedded to the scientific method and that he considered all the different possibilities in proximal origins. I know you're a professor, and I'm assuming you've been the senior author on many papers. I assume that you teach your younger researchers what is good scientific method and not good scientific method. In the abstract of proximal origins, Dr. Gary and his fellow authors state categorically that the virus is not a laboratory construct. That doesn't sound to me like open-mindedness, and I wonder what you would tell a younger researcher or someone you were instructing in the scientific method about putting categorical statements into a scientific paper.
Well, it's important to emphasize that the paper in question, Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, published in March 2020, was not a research article. It was an opinion piece. It was published as a commentary, which is the section in the journal that holds opinion pieces.
Well, they shoved it down our faces like it was gospel.
So it was an opinion piece.
Remember?
The authors were stating their opinion. But that opinion was not well-founded. In March of 2020, there was no basis to state that as a conclusion, as opposed to simply being a hypothesis. Moreover, we know that compelling evidence has been presented as a result of congressional inquiry in the House that 4 of the authors of that paper, Dr. Anderson, Dr. Gary, Dr. Holmes, and Dr. Rambeau, in their private communications, show clearly that they knew the conclusion that they stated in that article was invalid.
Fraud.
So in terms of what I would tell a younger scientist I would be mentoring, I would tell a younger scientist that you do not state a conclusion without evidence, even in an opinion piece in a scientific journal.
Yeah, and it's fraud, right? Because they had a motive to get a narrative out to serve their business interests. They used their veil of credibility, their authority, just like the CIA people did.
And you never, under any circumstances in a scientific journal, state conclusions that you know to be unsound.
Yes.
That represents scientific misconduct. It represents scientific misconduct up to and including fraud.
Yes.
And the paper in question, the Proximal Origin paper, has been recommended for review of retraction. 2 requests, one in 2023 and one in 2024, were submitted by teams of scientists to the journal in question, to the journal editors, asking them to add an editorial expression of concern and to initiate a review for retraction of the article.
I know of no other example in modern scientific history or publications where a publication has come forward pronouncing with such authority that the lab leak is implausible, it is not a laboratory construct, while privately saying, this is no friggin' conspiracy theory, it looks like it did, I'm 90-10, I'm 50-50. But no doubt in the paper. In fact, we know that it went back and forth with Dr. Fauci and with editors who say, we want the statements to be stronger, we want the conclusions to be stronger. That was actually coming from Nature at the time. We want you to doctor it up and even be more strong because we're making a political point here. That's where we should have known when we were off track, that these people were politicians and that they were pushing an idea because, as Dr. Collins finally admitted in one of the emails, this is about the business of science with China. This will disturb our relations with China if anybody questions this. Dr. Quay, the idea that this came from the fish market, I thought had been discredited by virtually all of the scientists. Now, I'm really surprised it's still being presented here. I know that the Chinese, the CDC, George Gao over there, basically said that they no longer consider it. And actually, if you think about it from their perspective, we're not sure if we can trust them. But at the same time, the Chinese, if they would rather have it come from a lab or the market, I think would choose the market over the lab. If anything, if we were going to think they were dishonest, it'd be dishonest towards saying, hey, we found some animals. If you could review stepwise, just a little bit slower, some of the evidence for why it's not there, the amount of animals tested, the animal handlers compared to SARS-1, but also the idea of this genetic diversity that, when SARS-1 came about the first time, I think it tried hundreds of times because these animal viruses don't infect humans well in the beginning. It tried hundreds of times over and over again. And even in the end, SARS-1 didn't transmit between humans very well. That's why containment worked. And that's why quarantine worked, because it wasn't very infectious. Go through a little bit, step by step, the evidence of why anybody still maintaining that it came from the market is misguided.
I mean, let me agree with Dr. Gary about SARS-1 being a spillover. And let me elaborate a little bit. There were 11 cities, 11 markets, 3 different lineages, and a 30 nucleotide difference among the initial cases and patients, which approximates about a year of posterior diversity, as it's called. SARS-2, of course, it's either in one market or it's in no markets. There's no other proposal for a market origin from it. 457 animals were tested in the market. 0 were found to be infected. SARS-1, 92 animals, 100% infected.
Wow.
The vendors, the wildlife vendors in SARS-1 were all infected. We have 10 vendors here. None of them are infected. One vendor had bamboo rats from southern China, where the backbone comes from. He wasn't infected. His animals weren't infected. SARS-2 has no posterior diversity. So it really, as Dr. Anderson said, it's one jump from one animal to one human. The most likely place that happens is in a laboratory.
Yeah.
And again, to be clear, when you say an animal, it could be a petri dish. It could be animal cells in a petri dish. The question of where the origins came from is the question of where the animal is. And they've tested 96 animals in nature, and they've tested 0 animals at Wuhan Institute of Virology. That's where we need to look.
Sure, it may have come from animals, but in the lab, or that were already a production or in production resulting from the lab. So that was Rand Paul. Really grateful that he's still digging into this. This is another exchange from Roger Marshall. And he asks another question that many of us were asking from the very beginning. Was this whole thing a bioweapon? Was this perfectly engineered for 2020, right? All of these things we got called conspiracy theorists for. Now they're asking these questions openly in the Senate because it's an interesting question.
Mr. Marshall, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think first of all, it's important to remember why we're here today. We're here today because we don't want to have another pandemic like this.
Right.
I think it's important that we recognize that 1 million Americans have lost a loved one, and they're still looking for closure. We have 15 million Americans with long COVID.
And we want recourse.
And perhaps if we knew the origin of COVID and the development, maybe that would give us a clue how to treat us. I want to start with Dr. Quay and go back to the diffuse grant for just a second. This is a grant by EcoHealth and Peter Daszak.
Yep.
Recall that Peter Daszak is David Morin's BFF. And that grant was denied, but yet it lays out a framework for the development of COVID-19. And you went through 6 or 7 several reasons that are absolutely consistent, that they said they would do X and they did X. And what are the chances of all those things ending up in a COVID virus?
Yeah, well, again, just as a reminder, so they said they were going to go to a particular spot in southern China to get a virus. They were going to make sure that it had diversity from SARS-1 of about 25%. They were going to put it into humanized mice to enhance its ability to recognize the receptor binding domain. They're going to pure and cleavage site in a very particular spot.
Which they did.
Out of 13,000 letters in the spike protein, they said in the grant they were going to put it at a spot called the S1, S2 junction. And so all of those were found in SARS-CoV-2. Its nearest neighbor is from the same area. It has a 99% binding affinity for the human receptor. SARS-1 jumped into humans. It only had 15% of the epidemic changes it needed to become epidemic.
What do you think the chances of all 6 or 7?
I've quantified it because I like statistics, and it's 1 in 1.2 billion.
Wow!
So 1 in a billion chance all that comes to fruition. There were some comments on that.
What is that for the math whizzes out there? Is that like an exponential, right? If you put like the number like 12 variables plus the exclamation point, 12 factorial, is that what it is? 1 in 1.2 billion.
Margin. So Dr. Berry, North Carolina, developed the technology for the protein spike. He taught Dr. Shi. He gave them humanized mice. Again, this was all funded with USAID grant money as well. What were some of the comments in the margin you think that are significant?
Well, this is important because the folks told DARPA DARPA, we're going to do this research in North Carolina under very high safety conditions in the grant. That's what they wrote. The marginal comments in drafts that were only obtained through FOIAs said a different thing. Daszak said, hey, we're going to shift this over to Wuhan because it'll be cheaper, faster. We'll get a lot more done that way. Barrett says, boy, if U.S. scientists knew this was going on, they would think this is crazy. This is in the marginal comments. So they, in a way, they weren't truthful with DARPA in the grant.
So Dr. Barrick,
oh, that sounds like fraud too, right? So you submit like a business record kind of a thing to the government. Supposed to be honest and truthful in there because they're going to give you a bunch of money back. Are they being prosecuted? Is Letitia James going to investigate them and seize their buildings? No, they all get away with it because they're friends with Fauci.
Along with Dr. Fauci, or the father of gain of function, knew that other scientists in America would have a fit if this was being done here.
Yeah, and again, fast forward to January 2020. These two scientists, Daszak and Barrick, sitting down with the sequence of SARS-CoV-2, and a computer would know within 1 hour, this thing has all the features of what we proposed in that grant. And the fact they either didn't tell anybody or the people they told didn't do anything about it meant that human-to-human transmission was not aware of that, and asymptomatic transmission we were not aware of. This is the first new respiratory virus that's asymptomatic.
Let's come back. I'm going to use that, come back to that point in just a second. We went through what I call the smoking guns that really show beyond a reasonable doubt that this virus was made in a laboratory in Wuhan, China. It was synthetic.
1.2 billion.
Everywhere from the geography of where it shows up for the first time to the fact that there was virus already spread to multiple continents by the time the wet market break occurs. They never have found the intermediate species. With SARS and MERS, it took months to find an intermediate species. Anyone that says the raccoon dog is the intermediate species is just laughable science. No progenitor viruses. The timeline, they were developing a vaccine already November 2019. Dr. Shi has taken down the DNA lab banks in September 2019. She takes down another lab bank here in this country, maybe March of the next year as well. But of all the smoking guns, and this is the hardest to explain to people, is just the genetic makeup of this virus. And you pointed out the protein spike. The protein spike alone would be like a person. That protein spike that fits into a lung cell would be like the chances of a person walking in the room with the key that fits the lock on those doors. I mean, it was a perfect protein spike. You mentioned the furin cleavage site, other spots. But I wanted to talk about the ORF8 site for just a second. Dr. Quay, what's the significance of this ORF8 site?
So ORF8 is a protein that's down near the right-hand side of the virus. It is not in the final virus. It is secreted into the bloodstream, and it does two things. Early in the infection, it blocks interferon expression, so you don't sweat, you don't have a fever, you don't show the symptoms of an infection. And later in the infection, it blocks what's called antigen MHC presentation. So we learned from HIV that a virus that can block the ability of pieces of the virus to be presented to the immune system is a virus that is very hard to make antibodies against, very hard to fight against it. Two master's theses during 2015 that have only been published in Chinese, no papers came from it, at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It created a synthetic cloning system for ORF8.
Nice.
So gain-of-function research around things that make viruses asymptomatic and things that make them not be able to make antibodies to are beyond the pale of what Dr. Ebright has said in terms of the civilian use.
So if I could, Dr. Quay,
no civilian use.
So really, this ORF8 is a synthetic link sequence never found in nature, and they place it in here, right? They place this link in here for the purposes of the two cardinal sins. The cardinal sin of asymptomatic virus and then transmission without that symptom as well, and the inability to make an immune response. I mean, that's the cardinal sins of gain-of-function research. What purpose would there be if you're wanting to develop vaccines? Is there any civilian purpose, or is this, in fact, a bioweapon?
I can't say it's a bioweapon because that's in the mind of the person that made it, but it is highly unusual, highly synthetic. They were doing synthetic biology around it, and its two functions are quite remarkable with respect to what kind of research you would do in the civilian world.
Is there a possibility that it could have been a dual purpose, that it could have been used as a bioweapon?
So the original SARS virus, SARS-CoV-1, is a tier 1 select agent in the United States. So it is in the group of pathogens and biological toxins that our federal government has identified as having high potential for use as a bioweapon in biowarfare, bioterrorism, or biocrime. It, by definition, therefore, according to our federal government, is a bioweapon agent. It is not a bioweapon, but it is an agent that potentially could be used.
Is there any good use, any good reason to put this in the virus if you're developing a vaccine?
I would return to my general comment on gain-of-function research on potential pandemic pathogens. That research has no civilian practical application. Researchers undertake it because it is fast, it is easy, it requires no specialized equipment or skills, and it was prioritized prioritized for funding and has been prioritized for publication by scientific journals. These are major incentives to researchers worldwide,
They just
in
tinker
China
around in
and
their
in
labs.
the U.S. The researchers undertake this research because it's easy, they get the money,
They get
and they
paid.
can get the papers.
They get paid. It's easy. It's a bunch of mad scientists tinkering around in their little labs with their test tubes and infecting the whole world. We know what happened there. They know what happened there. We're grateful that we have a couple senators who are digging into this to try to uncover the truth about what happened so it doesn't happen again. But where are the prosecutions? Where is Anthony Fauci? He's out on a book tour, hanging out with Rachel Maddow, crying his eyes out about how hard it's been for him to orchestrate this entire scam. So we've got Rand Paul ripping into this. Questions about the bioweapon now making their debut, making their resurgence in the Senate. We're going to continue to keep our eye on it. As we do, we'd love it if you joined us. Thank you so much for subscribing to our channel, for liking this video, for inviting someone you know or love to come here and join us when we go live. We'd also love it if you checked out some of the links in our description below and then joined us in our next segment, because the video that's coming up next that we're about to link over to right now is about more cheap fakes in the Biden administration. This guy just keeps stepping on it, and I don't know if the Russians are behind this or not, but we'll see you there in our next segment.